Nice. Hello.
Hi. Nice to meet you, Lauren.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, you have not talked to this particular radfem before, hmm?
Oh, radfem.
Well, I'm their lawyer.
What is a radfem? Is there one definition? Because it seems like everybody's got a different take.
I knew you were going to come out with these tough questions. I'm less philosophical on it. I take a radical feminist approach to my legal philosophy on looking at women's rights, and that's how I approach it. Why I object to defining woman by anything other than sex, because that's the basis of women's oppression throughout history and place and time.
Candice, do you jive with that?
I jive with that understanding of where radical feminists are coming from in centering and framing things based on an understanding of what the root problems and causes are. Mm-hmm. Differences between freedom and liberation, equality and equity, those kinds of conversations come into play when I think my lifelong political home has been more center right. And so very much more influenced by an individualistic kind of libertarian outlook on something like women's rights. Women's rights is not necessarily focused on until very recently on the right, in large part because I think there was an assumption or understanding that women that it is sufficient for women to be treated strictly legally equally in a lot of different regards, and then we leave up to the social realm to kind of order and control, if you will, the roles and expectations placed on men and women. But legally, it's just all well and good if there's strict legal equality going on between the sexes. And I think now recently, the right is waking up and realizing that if we don't talk about women as a unique, specific class and group of people with unique needs and challenges based on being women, then we're facing an actual breakdown of, I think, rational law and stable society.
Okay. We're already in the deep end, so you mind if I flesh this out a little bit? To what extent should justice be blind to class? To what extent should justice see and evaluate class? And then how do we make sure that class doesn't become politicized by making the law favor classes rather than being strictly blind? And I know blind is an ideal, so it's probably not ever been real that anything's ever blind, let alone the law. But
well, if there is such a thing as blindness, then I think it's also very possible and reasonable and desirable to analyze who benefits from that blindness. You know, that's a little bit John Rawls of me, but I think there is something to that. Because if there's a very predictable pattern and outcome of understanding who benefits from not taking into account group characteristics, much less individual characteristics or needs, then I think that opens up being worth a discussion of where universality of application of law has to remain the vision, the ideal, the starting point, and when an adjustment to that pure universality is warranted. And I think that's what the liberal Enlightenment project over the last couple hundred years has actually made a lot of good progress toward.
Lauren, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, well, so when I think of it as members of a class, there's there's only so much benefit I get from other people being able to have their rights assured, right? So when you measure it by groups, looking at women specifically, looking at the universal rights, civil liberties, and things like that, those baseline things, those are not, you can't measure that with groups. You can't measure that, women as a group are able to exercise these rights in this certain amount of way. It really does come down to the individual with that. In terms of justice, I don't know if you mean the justice system specifically. I think that needs to be mostly blind to demographics, but then there's just realities too. Looking at the justice system specifically, I think about criminal justice, and they treat young offenders differently than older offenders, and not just teenagers, but they literally will look at a 20-year-old much differently than a 40-year-old committing the same crime, with different things. And so I think if you say we're going to treat every individual as if they are exactly the same, that is not justice. But I also think that there's a really fine line between doing that and taking into account generalities. I was going to say more too about the radical feminist label. Basically, I think that I have some discomfort with it only because it obviously means such different things to different people. And so I prefer to be vague about it just so that I don't feel like it misrepresents, my stance on things. But in my time at Wolf, I will say meeting so many wonderful feminist women who are not really tied to obviously liberal feminism, but also just the mainstream ideas. I've met so many women with like a real deep respect for the Constitution and for due process and for really just evidence-based, rational, reason-based kind of policy and law. And so that has done a lot to shape my, my view of the law in this area and in women's rights. And women like Candice and lots of other women who are more either in the center or on the right have really helped me just really see the balance of where some things need to be conserved versus there's things that need progress on. Like there's not an ideology that really fits anything. Like no one's really kind of got it all right. Except me. No.
Well, if you can prove it in a court of law, then I suppose so.
We'll see.
Lauren, how did you get into law? What pushed you in that direction? Do you come from a long pedigree of lawyers and attorneys?
No. No, I like to argue and be right. And so it was often joked upon that I should go to law school. And I got my bachelor's in political science and environmental studies. And I was kind of interested in that. And then I was interested in labor and employment. And I ended up graduating into the recession with my bachelor's. And I worked as a CNA for a couple of years. And then I hated it. And so I was like, let me just see how I do on my LSATs. And I did great. And so I went to law school and still wasn't sure what I wanted to do exactly. And I've done a lot of stuff since then. So.
What's a CNA?
Oh, certified nursing assistant.
Okay. That's what I figured the N.
I worked with adults with disabilities, did home care.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are you both working on? And how did you get to concretize this partnership?
Yeah. Well, we've been working together for a year and a half or more on a particular lawsuit in California challenging placing men into women's prisons there. So it was working through that lawsuit that, kind of started then recent conversations along the lines of, there are a lot of inquiries that come into Wolf that need to be handled that maybe don't match up with a nonprofit's ability to do that. There are, I've been volunteering with GenSpect, and so I've been trying hard for months to, network with attorneys and match, say, detransitioners and parents up with lawyers who are willing to challenge schools and challenge therapists and so forth. And so finally, it just seemed to coalesce into, let's really think about, if we're seeing this kind of need out there, why shouldn't we be the ones that jump out and try to meet some of that need? We need more female attorneys. We need more women's rights attorneys. We need more just, heterodox attorneys right now to specifically jump out into the space of saying, we're willing to go against the narrative. We want to help restore a sane and rational view to law, starting with the basic facts that 5 minutes ago we all understood and took for granted, so that we can make some progress toward, I think, getting back on track with equality between the sexes. Parental rights in public schools was getting a little off kilter. So I think there are a lot of ways in which the gender war is kind of emblematic and front and center, and a necessary current prioritized phase and step in order to, I think, have a hope of good progress for just about any other group going forward.
Yeah, I think this realization, sort of through discussion and kind of our own observations, that there was a need for something like this happened alongside, Candice was realizing the stuff that she was doing, working on the Chandler case and other stuff on this area was really what she wanted to be doing full time, instead of working at a firm doing other stuff full time. And me realizing that I really liked doing the direct legal services more so, and wanting to provide that. And it's something just that makes me feel more energized. It's a really hard subject area to do work in. It can be very demoralizing. And so kind of getting my hands dirty a little bit and getting the weeds with it is really, I find it very motivating. So
okay. So you brought up a lot of different areas that need attention. There's women or males and female prisons. There's school, how the schools are dealing with parents and children. There's how doctors are held accountable or not held accountable for possible medical malpractice. So those are three different areas. And then there's defining woman in law on the state level, on the federal level. So this is a huge...
Free speech. Employment law.
Free speech on, and then you're looking at Section 230. You're looking at private versus public online speech, right? So, like, where do you even begin? Or are you guys at this point kind of making a map and then organizing services so that you can pair, clients with attorneys and stuff?
Well, I'd say we started with, we already have clients. We already have, cases that we start out with, and then others that have joined up in the last month. But I think part of it is us sitting down and realizing or figuring out what our collective areas that we can do from a technical perspective. And then there's a lot of other things that, being sort of subject matter experts, are in a position to be helpful to other legal professionals or other, school districts, or people who just need, people or entities who need help getting guidance, not necessarily in a particular subject area, but on this issue. So I think that's part of it. And then it's just seeing what comes in.
Of that, where right now, I think a lot of family law attorneys are taken by surprise at the gender issue and how it has swept through the system to the point where it is a real uphill battle for any non-affirming parent to retain custody and visitation, those kinds of issues right now. And so that's just one example where directly and through consulting with other attorneys, we would like to help, bring the legal system up to speed in that area in terms of, well, wait a minute. This isn't all just consensus toward affirmation going on here. Here is the pushback that's going on. Here is the skepticism and the questions that are legitimately raised by experts and by parents and so forth. And so trying to bring some balance into legal areas like family law and what's going on with child protective services, things like that.
So where's the priorities right now? Just to get a little bit more concrete. I guess there's case by case, there's databasing, there's finding precedent, getting up the word.
Well, one of the big ones is prisons, because we do have, Candice and I are still counsel on Chandler, the lawsuit.
And that's in California?
Still,
Yep.
And many states are adopting similar rules with or without the legislation to go along with it, or whether it's just administrations being like, well, this is how we're going to do it. Because part of the math that's going on is that in most areas, and incarceration is very much true, men are much more likely to complain, to make grievances, to sue than women are. It's just very much the case, anecdotally, and just what you see. And then, so if you are a prison administrator trying to figure out the balance of rights between, safety and rights and who's going to complain, who's going to sue you, it's a lot easier choice to make. And we want to make that a more difficult choice. So, at its core for prisons and other things like that. But we want to see the slow or stop the spread of these policies, right, into new areas, into new places. So there's that. And then obviously the medical and the mental health profession with regards to these harmful medical interventions on people, especially children. Those are two big ones.
So is it a tactic of establishing disincentivizing forces, like preparing the groundwork for people being held accountable or institutions having to pay concretely, and then that will cause them to be wary of going forward? Is that?
Yeah, that's definitely a tactic, because, I think for the last half decade or so, institutions, corporations, schools have really only had in their ear the LGBTQ activist side and the ACLU side that is saying, if you don't push the law further than it even is right now, if you don't do these things as best practices, we'll sue you. You will be sued. It's very dangerous for you not to go this direction. And that's been very successful. And there just has not been a concerted pushback to let schools and institutions know that the reality is they're kind of on a razor's edge. That's just where it is right now. Things are unsettled enough that they're probably very likely to get sued no matter which direction they go. But they should know that there's a dual risk going on.
So would it come down to which is the bigger bully, if they're
maybe? So, a mental health therapist should be thinking twice. Am I going to get charged with discrimination for refusing to affirm and wanting to explore talk therapy solutions and not write a surgery letter or a hormone letter? Am I going to get sued and attacked and complained about because of that? Maybe. If I rush this, 17-year-old or even 19-year-old down this path, and I haven't explored a lot with this person, but I just take them at their word and send them on this path, they get their double mastectomy, or they, am I going to have issues, 2 years from now? Maybe. They need to be thinking about both of those sides.
And it's insurance companies too. I mean, the truth is, we're seeing this with laws restricting abortion. Is you see doctors in hospitals who are like, they do not want their people to get charged. They've got malpractice insurance saying we're not going to do this. And I hate making that comparison or anything, but I mean, because that's not a good thing from my perspective at all. It's a very bad thing. But it's, if you have malpractice insurance telling these doctors and telling these professionals that they can't do certain things or can't do it in a certain way, or if they do it in a certain way, it's not covered under the policy, that's going to change practices.
So how are insurance companies held accountable then? What's the interface between law and insurance companies?
If you file a malpractice claim, they're going to call their insurance company.
And
I think we're finding out from a lot of detransitioners that insurance companies are getting a bit of a free pass right now. That's another angle that we want to try to course correct on. Because as to detransitioners, you would think that insurance companies would be motivated to hit the brakes on gender transition procedures just for cost. They're, right? Stereotype of the big bad insurance company is they want to cut everybody off from everything that they possibly can and save a nickel, right? For some reason, that has not really been the case. There's been quite a bit of voluntary, not even having to be pulled through law to do it, to go ahead and cover a lot of these procedures. And yet insurance companies we're seeing with detransitioners feel perfectly entitled to throw in the obstacles and throw up the brakes toward anybody who wants to look at any kind of reversal, reconstruction, different pathway. I no longer have a gender identity, but now I have very specialized, complicated medical needs going on. You need to help me out here. And insurance companies are very too freely making that very difficult for detransitioners.
that seems odd. So there's the profit motive, which has been hinted at and covered by various, specifically radical feminists or feminists themselves, bringing up pharmacological profit motive behind gender medicine. But if it's all footed by the insurance companies, then it just seems like the math wouldn't work out for them long term to hook up a whole bunch of young people to lifelong medicalization that then has to be paid for by someone through them, right? So
that's a really interesting piece of this whole thing to me is there are legal, rules about that have come up about having to cover certain things, but in general, as Candice said, it has been mostly voluntary. And I think it is clearly related to some of the social cultural side of it, and I can't explain it, and it's very weird. I can't think of any other examples of something like that happening in that way, but
well, I guess, okay, so just shooting from the hip, these insurance companies get woke cred of some sort, get some sort of social cred for being affirming, and then they get to fly the different rainbow flags or all these different kinds of flags and say that we are representing these, we're on board, and so they get social cachet or status.
That's true. I wonder if, because it's related to the corporate thing, is you have these large corporations who are purchasing policies for their employees, and I suppose they're probably getting feedback from their employees that they want those type of things covered. I worked in a tech company, and they offered all kinds of interesting things. They offered up to $50,000 per surrogacy if you got a surrogate to pay for, which, again, is from the perspective of people want it, but from their perspective, they'd much rather pay a chunk for you to have someone else carry a baby than the risk of losing out on an employee having to have health issues or productivity issues related to their own pregnancy. But
I think that the gender stuff it's an ideology and a motivator that it makes looking at the financial gains and channels I think just a one-dimensional thing. Is there money to be made? Is there money being made off of this? Of course, yes. It was wonderful for Big Pharma to find an entirely new, huge, never-ending, potentially infinite market for its drugs. And it's great for surgeons to have, more expensive, complicated, very much in need of multiple procedure surgeries to be able to perform at the state's expense, at an insurance company's expense, or much less if somebody can walk in and pay for it, and it's all socially supported and encouraged. That's great for them too. So the money factor is there, but I don't think that is the tipping point. I don't think that is what has pushed a false consensus within the medical system of the U.S. and many other countries. And that's the other thing that you can tell, is that other countries are not as susceptible to the profit motive in their medical industries as the United States is, and yet gender ideology and affirmation only has swept through countries regardless of how single payer or socialized or free market their healthcare system is. So the profit motive is not the only thing going on. It very much has been, I think, a capture and an incentive placed on people within the medical industries to jump on board a social trend and a social movement that provides not so much even a financial cachet, and not just the social cachet of, look what a good person I am, but almost this plays into the savior complex on a personal level. I am now invested in saving a person, maybe, particularly a young person. And that comes from the way that the notions about gender and the concepts behind it have come in through the vehicles of civil rights, minority rights, individual autonomy and empowerment, equity and inclusion, and that's a feel-good channel.
Mm-hmm. So could you walk me through the mechanics of how an insurance company would be corrected in this manner? So I assume that there's these things called a malpractice suit. How does that go through? Is there a certain court that people go through? And I know it varies by state, but just...
Yeah, it's almost always in the general civil court of the state. There might be special procedural rules and limits that apply just to medical malpractice or professional malpractice like that, like the time limits to bring this lawsuit, the types and amounts of damages that can even potentially be recovered, requirements about needing to have expert testimony to establish what the standard of care was and whether there was a breach of that standard of care. So rules like that would be a little bit specialized, but generally it's like any other lawsuit in that sense. The insurance companies would come into play there by only if they were on the hook to pay for the defense and any judgments against the medical professionals or mental health professionals who are being sued. The other way to go after insurance companies directly that we're exploring is, most of them have administrative complaint systems that are overseen by agencies within the state. So state to state, there's some oversight of insurers in that way. At some point, if things line up in the right way, the traditional lawsuit directly against your own insurance company for treating you badly, it could be a bad faith insurance claim, saying that an insurance company owed me a fiduciary responsibility. It acted in its own best interest instead of mine. And then you can have a direct lawsuit against the insurance company, not against who they were providing insurance to in terms of your providers.
So, sorry,
this is all against the backdrop too of pressures going in the other direction. So we've got, talking about individuals fighting back in their capacity, but we've got the Federal Department of Health and Human Services currently has proposed rules that would overturn the existing rules and would make it discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Gender identity is obviously the one that is more relevant for this, to discriminate in medicine. And they're not just talking about, people getting turned away from the ER. They're talking about if you are a pediatric endocrinologist who works with sick kids with endocrine issues, and you can't refuse to prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to a child with diagnosed gender dysphoria because it's discriminatory. Or if you are a doctor who does mastectomies and you specialize in that and you work with breast cancer patients. You can't refuse to do it for someone with dysphoria. And so they are looking to make that a violation of federal law to make those choices. And so at that point, then you have someone suing them for doing it. You almost end up getting less into the should it be covered, should it not be, and more into the granularity of like, is it meeting these standards? But there are no current standards. And then you also have like the Equality Act. I know sure you've heard of that, but that is another area where it would consider medical services, including insurance companies and mental health providers. Discrimination would be the same thing. To not provide affirming care would be considered a violation of federal law for that as well.
And so this federal law to make it discriminatory, that's coming from the executive branch or legislative?
It's their proposed rulemaking.
Okay.
It's coming from the executive branch. The Equality Act has been bandied about on the legislative side.
Okay. So how would it occur that the federal government, the executive branch, gets to mandate medical care? That's
the Affordable Care Act, for starters.
Okay. Yeah. So the Affordable Care Act.
The proposed rulemaking is amending the Affordable Care Act, yeah.
Okay. So the Affordable Care Act is a blanket set of rules that applies across the United States that everybody has to obey.
Yes, I mean, states. It applies to people in a very narrow way, individuals, but largely when it comes to how states are supposed to administer things is where the impact will be had most significantly. When it comes to why would gender services be covered because of the ACA, it's the anti-discrimination provisions of that law. So the ACA did what it did in terms of controlling what insurers have to cover. But it didn't set forth a specific mandate regarding gender transition. That is coming out of the ACA claiming that it's really just solidifying and making sure that federal civil rights non-discrimination laws that we're all familiar with and that have been around for a long time are definitely going to apply to how insurers and providers do things. So don't be, it's just incorporating and referencing back to things like Title IX and Title VI to say, race and ethnicity and national origin and sex and so forth are grounds for discrimination that we're just going to keep a very close eye on and make sure that that's not what's occurring in healthcare. But like Lauren is saying, what's happening is a conceptual stretch and flip of the very concept of what is discrimination. That's what's happening every which way, every place where the law is incorporating gender identity alongside of sex as a characteristic. And what it's not even the problem of listing that vague characteristic called gender identity, which never gets a definition and is somehow related to sex and somehow not. The bigger problem legally is what gets assumed to be discrimination. You could say, don't be punitive to somebody. Don't be hateful to them. Don't, like Lauren said, kick them out of the ER just because they claim a gender identity. Great, fair. I don't think any of us would have a problem with that. It's a little disturbing when the law doesn't define something properly, but that's probably going to be workable. It's saying that we're going to call it illegal discrimination to fail to validate, to fail to cater to an individual's subjective description or desire or demand.
And activists do say that they either say or they imply that they're trying to do that. Like someone's going to walk in and they're not going to get insulin prescribed for their diabetes. But they actually point to the complaints that have actually been made under this provision. And it's not that. It's all dead naming and misgendering and didn't get to whatever. It's that kind of stuff. And so it really it's
Right. So if stating becomes illegal discrimination, we think that's a big problem. You know, if it becomes discrimination illegal to state someone's sex, especially in a medical context, that's problematic. So
like an ER, yeah,
kind of thing that is being lumped in under look at all of the discrimination in healthcare that needs to stop.
Okay, so if a state of sufficient power, let's say Florida, says gender identity doesn't exist, we do not believe in it. It has no basis in fact, and we're not going to cater to it. Then the federal government, and I think there's overtures of this, will punish Florida somehow for that. The federal government would have to enforce this on the state if a state decided to opt out. Right. And would that be
one way a state could do it, or the state could be sued by their own citizens or entities within the state to enforce the federal provisions. There were 20 states that sued the Biden administration over that executive order that applied Bostock to these other areas. And they actually issued a preliminary injunction in that case for Title VII and Title IX so that it doesn't apply to, or I'm sorry, not Title VII overall, but the part of Title VII that has like sex separated bathrooms, locker rooms, dress codes, bona fide occupational qualifications, etc. And so almost half of all states, it's not in force for now, but they're doing rulemaking on that as well. So that'll be a whole nother fight when that comes up.
I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on YouTube. But so could we walk through that? Like, so Biden administration issued an executive order. This was the gender order. It was like day one, right?
Day one.
And then it was followed up with guidance about 6 months later. The Department of Justice, Department of Education issued guidance that backed up that executive order and said it is definitely our policy. Workplaces and in educational environments, sex includes anything that says don't discriminate based on sex includes gender identity. And further, again, this is the discrimination problem. Not only must you not discriminate based on gender identity, but it is discrimination to fail to affirm gender identity, even with respect to any kind of sex separated space or activity.
So what's the legal recourse for the states? So the states sue. How do they sue? How do you sue the federal government as a state?
They filed a suit. Who was the defendant, Candice? Was it
they sued
Biden?
Yeah, they sued the Education Department directly.
Labor, too? Because wasn't it the EEOC, the other?
Yeah.
I should know this.
But who do they bring the suit to? Like the federal?
Yeah.
They filed in federal court.
In federal court, yep. Saying the federal government has issued a new interpretation of an existing law that goes way beyond the scope of that existing law. They didn't even bother to get public notice and input before they did this through their guidelines. So it needs to be suspended. It needs to be temporarily halted, and finally a judge agreed with that and has halted it.
And in each of those states, they had a state law properly passed by their elected representatives, which directly contradicted the guidance. And so that's the controversy that was brought before the court, was they literally can't enforce their own state laws without following or without violating this guidance. And this guidance is nothing. It doesn't have, it's a piece of paper, basically. Now, it's a piece of paper where they can absolutely use it to punish you and come after you. But in terms of having the same force of law as a law passed by an elected body, there's no comparison, basically. And especially when you have something like, most of them, I think, are sports laws that have to do with it. And it's really unclear where federal versus state jurisdiction lays anyway, right? So even if there was a different kind of mismatch there, it would still be having to decide those two things. But the fact is that, I mean, they literally are directing them to do two different things. And so the court recognized that while the rest of the case is being heard, they needed to be able to enforce their own state laws. And so they put that on hold for them.
So just, again, I'm totally ignorant in this area. So there's this federal court system, and then there's this Department of Justice. What's the power relationship between the Department of Justice and the federal courts? Can who has more power? Who's sovereign?
They're in separate branches of government, right? So when you look
Department
at
of Justice's executive branch,
from a checks and balances point of view, in a way, you should be saying equal power, because when the DOJ is acting in its appropriate role, defending the executive branch, prosecuting and implementing laws on behalf of the executive branch, being sort of the whole executive branch's lawyer, when it's doing that role as it should be doing it, then it prevails if it's in its lane. The check and balance is that the federal judiciary is set up with independent judges who have lifelong tenure and supposedly don't have to be influenced by who currently is in charge of the executive branch or who's running Congress, right? It's supposed to be this independent third branch. And so when they are in their lane, and that was from the beginning of our country established as they're the ones that get to interpret what the Constitution means. So if the executive branch is stepping outside of constitutional bounds, then it should be able to be reined in by the judicial branch, the federal judicial branch. That's how it should work.
Well, yeah, theoretically, but power gets mucky. So the federal branch, let's just take sports. If the states don't do what the federal branch, the executive branch wants, then the executive branch can, I'm just supposing, can do two basic things. One, deny funding, and two, requisition assets. Either not give assets or take assets, right, basically?
Yeah, I mean, under a law like Title IX, the federal executive branch is kind of limited to at some point terminating funding. Congress is free to pass laws that are more direct than that don't just attach strings and commands to funding, but make outright commands and prohibitions if that's done under circumstances where Congress is allowed to do that, under its Commerce Clause power, for example, as opposed to under its Spending Clause power. So if there is a clash, a direct conflict, federal law is supposed to prevail. But I guess, so if it's a state law versus federal law, they conflict and the state challenges the federal government. That is where the judiciary, the federal judges, are supposed to break that tie.
This is one of those basic things. You were talking about basic principles of what we do. Federal versus state versus local versus individual. And then the different branches of federal and state and all of this. This is like basically where we work for anything we're doing. It's kind of in this intersection between these things. It's not easy to follow, especially if you don't do it every day. And it changes all the time.
And, well, if we look at the behavior of the executive branch right now, and not to get too political, but watching the FBI, there was just a story where the FBI, the LA Times of all places, issued a story that the FBI's just drilled through a bunch of private bank accounts and stuff. The raid of Mar-a-Lago, don't want to get into it, but we see the law enforcement being used politically. Now, whether it's justified or not, it still sets a precedent that we don't know what's the restraint on the Department of Justice. What's the restraint on the FBI? So I said that the FBI, the Fed can deny funding, maybe take funding, but it also can put you in jail if you're not doing what you want, or if you're not thinking what they want, or if you're questioning, let's say, election results. So that's happening over in this political sphere, Republicans versus Democrats. But I think it does translate into gender care, into health care. We see this pit bull of the DOJ enforcing, without the consent of the governed. It just seems really scary. So I guess you guys, I know you're both, well, at least one of you is radical feminists, and I apologize for using the word guys. That's just a California thing, so I apologize if that's offensive. But you two are sorry. You're both getting in the weeds, right? Mapping out. I'm sorry, I need a drink of water. So, to put that in context, from an outsider's point of view, it looks really scary. The environment looks really scary, but you guys are right up in there in the law, organizing and petitioning and stuff like that. So where is the hope or the gains to be made, or when we organize the playing field with regards to gender, sports, prisons, healthcare, what are some of the, things that we can stand on?
Here's some of my optimism, some of my hope. I think for one thing, there has not yet been much in terms of volume in the U.S. in terms of just starting to flood the courts with pushback, just simple pushback. It comes back to language, lawyers being willing to use plain, clear, understood language. Not cowing, not being fearful, not being defensive about saying these are men, these are women, and these are why. These are the reasons why it makes a whole lot of sense, and for a long time has actually been upheld to give women this kind of privacy or this kind of safety or this kind of protection. And just say it. Because for several years now, the toe in the water, kind of, sort of, either you couldn't find legal representation to try, to push this at all, or it was only with a lot of apology. Well, I'm very sorry to even have to be saying it this way, but really, couldn't we find maybe a way to soften? So there needs to be just a little bit more. I don't think we can say that we're defeated in lawfare around this until and unless we've got a good pattern of even pushing it and getting court records out there with briefings that spell things out and call in witnesses and experts and so forth, and just start building these cases. If we can make it past first hoops, the next big round of optimism that I take for the U.S. is what I see over in the U.K., that a couple of their big trials, once you can get somebody from our opposition, the pro-gender crowd, once you can get them on the stand where they have to answer questions, it is embarrassing for them. It is weird. It is unusual courtroom drama. The level of self-contradiction and lack of coherence and just, it is odd. And that gets exposed. So the more that we can push past initial stages of any kind of lawsuit where the essence of what's going on and what the problem is a theory of gender identity versus a fact of sex, wherever that is the heart of the legal issue that's going on, the more that can be exposed so that people who have been able to push this through totally behind the scenes have to sit there and try to answer questions that the public can be witness to.
Okay.
We got the ACLU in Chandler in our California prison case saying that they're denying our allegations that men and women are different and that there are.
Wait, did they do this in a brief or on the stand?
No, it's their lawyers. I'll send it to you. It's beautiful. It's horrible.
So the story is that you made a complaint, basically that men and women are different.
That was one of many things we said, yeah.
And they denied the existence of a sex category.
Yes.
Meaningful. Yeah, they said that there was no, I don't have it in front of me. Basically, that there was no factors that separate men as a class from women as a class. We were arguing in the context of there's a reason why we have men's and women's prisons. They have not yet come back and said, actually, come to think of it, we think sex is a dumb way to split it up. No, they want sex separated prisons with their special fancy exceptions.
Oh, okay. So in physical reality, there's men and women, but let's just leave that off the table. In legal reality, there's men's prisons and women's prisons. Mm-hmm. The ACLU in California doesn't want to make everything unisex. They still want to keep those categories, but allow bleed.
That's right.
Between.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. That is the pattern just about everywhere you can think of. Okay. I had that weird, the Atlantic article recently. For the most part, sports. No, for the most part, the pro-gender crowd is not calling for co-ed sports, right? They are calling to leave everything the same in terms of having a women's team versus a men's team. They just want access to those teams, basically.
Because it's not about inclusion, it's about validation and affirmation. It's not about, I want to, eliminate visible differences as much as possible so everyone feels comfortable, which I would object to being compelled to do anyway. But it's not even that. It's that we want to maintain these things. We're going to take what used to be female and we're going to call it the feminine crowd. Doesn't matter if you don't want to be feminine, Candice. Okay, so you're still going to be over there if you want to be over there. And if you're not over there, we're going to put you over there with the masculine. It used to be men, but now it's masculine. That's where you're going to go if you don't want to be there. But we have to have, it's going to be purely based on, how much you like stereotypes. We had this I did a amicus brief for Wolf last year for this beauty pageant case. And it was where this...
In Oregon?
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, it was Anita Green versus the Miss United States of America. This delusional man, he argued, I just don't understand why they put this in writing and think that they sound good. But he literally said that he thought that he was a woman because he was stereotypically feminine. He used that phrase a few times. And no one seemed to see the issue with this, that defining like female by being stereotypically feminine. Yet the National Center for Lesbian Rights write a brief in his favor. Then again, there's a woman who identifies as a straight man who is their legal director. So, just saying.
But is she a lesbian?
She's married to a woman.
But she identifies as a straight man. So,
but she's representing lesbians.
Heterosexual and male as you presumably are.
Okay.
Sorry
back
for
to the
a headache.
I've been.
My point is they need the stereotypes. They need to do away with the sex distinctions, and they need, So that's where they hate the radical feminists, because we're like, let's keep the sex distinctions. It totally makes sense. And let's do away with anything else that's not. And they want to do the opposite. They want to pretend everybody's exactly the same, and that there's categories of people who are feminine, masculine, and other, which is everybody.
Yeah.
Really. So I object to that.
Back to that sports issue where they want to keep, or even prisons, they want to keep these two categories, but they want to apply bleed. They want to give a special category. So what, in effect, that means is that trans rights are special rights. These are special human beings. Yes. These are transcendent human beings. They're supernal through the law over everybody else.
And you can't even say trans people get special rights, because to me you got to walk that back. Who are the trans people, right? How do we know who is?
It's all men.
Who are the trans? Right? Who really are the
trans people?
That's a problem that goes back to this very characteristic or categorization of a group of people is so individualized. It is so subjective. there is intentionally no allowance of having any measurable reference point, any objective reference point to look to say, oh, got it. Okay, these are the trans people, and let's figure out what they need. It is porous, to say the least. It's amorphous. Who is in that I could be in that category if I wanted to. No problem.
You are wearing shoulder pads, which
yes.
And it's 2022, so that.
So obviously, when Lauren says they need they actually need the sex binary to stay in existence. They won't admit that outright. They don't like to say it that way, but that's very clear because, again, they don't want to collapse the sex distinctions and categories in spaces and activities. They want to keep them. They also very much need, though, the stereotypes that society builds around the sexes. They need to hold on to those because they're not actually calling to redesignate sports. Here's the feminine team and here's the masculine team. Mm-hmm. They need the combination. It is a sex binary, even though they don't like talking about it that way. So the presumption is still going to remain that females go here, males go here. It's now a question of the crossover because of adherence to stereotypes. That adherence to stereotypes is the justification, essentially, for validating your feeling of wanting to switch over. And yes, it is special rights, not any kind of equal rights, because it is requiring a self-selecting, self-chosen, anytime I want exemption from generally applicable, neutral, factual rules.
Well, I spoke with Linda Blade way too long ago. I have to have her back on. She's a sports coach, like top of her class, a sports coach. And she brought up an incident where in the same kind of Olympic competition where there's a bunch of sports. It wasn't the Olympics, but it was a big sports meet. One man identified as a female in one category and a male as another category. So he was able to...
So brave.
Stunning, to say the least. So I wonder if it's possible to steelman this. If through gender identity, that's the path that the law is taking to cement these stereotypes, how would they make that concrete? Like what?
Self-ID.
Okay, so self-ID, and that is based on, I guess, self-determination. Is that, and that would derive from what law? Like, from the legal point of view, how would you build the case for the existence of gender identity?
Build the case for legal recognition of gender identity. I think I would hide behind, and some laws use this as a separate phrase, I would hide behind gender expression. And claim that all we're really trying to get at mainly is making sure that people feel free to express themselves and aren't weirdly punished for not fitting into boxes. So how gender in the sense of how I choose to express being female. Now it's just, that is a good thing. That's been recognized in sex discrimination law for decades. That it's not just about we're going to treat males and females differently, but it might be in the sense of holding males or females to certain stereotyped expectations. That in and of itself is a form of sex discrimination. That sounds fine. So then it's just a little bit of a leap, right? To say that my desire to express my gender actually determines or changes my sex.
Okay, so it starts with freedom of expression, and then it goes to acceptance of that expression, right? So there's the expression that somebody's sending out into the world, and then there's the recognition by other people. And the law is able to enforce how people recognize other people?
I think this is a new thing that's going on right now where, yes, the law is attempting to to enforce how people perceive or express their perception of other people. And there is and all of that is now against a backdrop of you're not allowed to start from a factual premise. You're not allowed to start from any kind of shared, accepted, neutral statement of fact. This is a male human being. This is a female human being. That's where we're starting. Now, are we going to make demands of, despite that fact, are we now going to make a demand of some kind of accommodation or compelled expression of belief contrary to where we know we started from factually?
We're seeing this play out. I mean, SB 132 in California is a great example because they crafted that law in such a way as to, I guess, accept gender identity in the broadest way possible. And I look at, there's a man who was transferred over who's done some very depraved things to women who have been locked up with him. And he has been described as being comfortable with any pronouns. So one of the Transgender Law Center's own witnesses for this individual, so someone who believes he should still be in the women's prison, believes in the trans thing, refers to him as he, him in their declaration, in this witness statement. And then they go on to refer to him as she, her in their brief. It's post-truth. He's comfortable with any pronouns, so there's nothing wrong with them saying she, her, right? Just because he goes by he, him to everyone who's locked up with him.
Okay, so it's one thing for the law to be blind. It's another thing for the law to be cross-eyed. Like, it just seems like you're seeing double at that point. Like, it just seems really messy just to scan what's going on or who they're
So that's where they get you, though, because then now you're at that point, and now the simplest thing is to just accept people for who they are. Boom, we can move on with our day, right? Like, that's, now you don't have to figure it out anymore. You can just give in and just, people are who they say they are.
There's a, oh, sorry, Candice.
This is why it to me, one of the primary tactics in legal action around gender identity needs to be working very hard to have gender identity as a theory, as a set of beliefs, put into at least the same legal bucket as religious or spiritual beliefs, because that way the sincerity isn't an issue, the subjectivity and having to pierce through it isn't an issue. All that's at issue is your right to hold beliefs that either cannot be proved or even run counter to factual proof, but you have a right to hold those beliefs. And we have a pretty good system for deciding to what extent is the importance to you of putting your beliefs into practice. How far can that be accommodated, and must that be accommodated before we are going to say, no, there's a line somewhere where your right to put into practice your belief stops at the right of other people not to be compelled to pretend to share your belief, and to not make it purely subjectively your choice whether it is good for everybody else, to allow you to exempt yourself from fact-based general rules like sex classifications.
Okay, this might be fruitful, it might not be. But let's say that you have a prison and it's in California. Most people are probably just Christian, basically culturally Christian, and there's a few Muslims and a few Jews in the same prison. The Muslims and the Jews, according to their religion, don't eat pork. The prison gets really cheap pork, but in order to accommodate the dietary needs of this religious class, these two religious classes, they will spend a little bit extra money to create halal food or kosher food, or to allow for that? Or do they have to what degree does the prison have to completely overhaul its culinary runnings in order to serve 5% of the population, right? And
Yeah. Not. I mean, surprisingly, to quite a large degree, I would say. Prison religious belief is an area where the prison does have to put up a decent reason, usually more than just cost alone, to show why it can't accommodate a belief like hair length or regulation or a dietary regulation.
The big difference, I think, is where the party being inconvenienced is the government versus another individual. So that's, for me, a lot of my starting point is it costing the government extra money to get some halal food and some kosher food in there versus is my right to eat this food? Is it somehow, I don't know, just within that example, it means they don't have enough money to feed enough to the other people. Like, I don't know, it's like a goofy example, but just it's a totally different analysis to me when it's financial and the burden is being borne by the people who are responsible for keeping them safe in aggregate.
So is there the possibility in California for a third prison, a unisex or gender prison of genders?
Gender diverse prison.
Yeah, gender diverse prison. And would it be reasonable for the state to foot the bill for a third facility?
If I worked for the Attorney General's office, then what I would try and do, now that there's been a lawsuit, because the Prison Rape Elimination Act forbids segregation of trans-identified inmates except via court order. So I would take this opportunity to ask them to order us to have a waiver to create a third space. That's what I would do if I was in the Attorney General's office.
So could you walk us through that? What's this rape clause?
Prison Rape Elimination Act.
Okay.
It puts a set of rules in place regarding having procedures and data collection and things like that. It's a federal law, but it applies to federal and state facilities, it applies to jails, it applies to anywhere where people are criminally held by the state. And so there's no private right of action. It's just, it's a mandate that goes with funding. So it's one of those things where, again, if you're not following it, then you lose your funding. One of the rules, regulations, this wasn't in the initial bill that was passed by Congress. It was later rulemaking by the agency, much less scrutiny. But they said that you could not segregate inmates on the basis of transgender status, essentially. And from what I understand, the reasoning behind that is because, especially when you look at jails or smaller kind of
Holding facilities.
prison, you get smaller areas, smaller jurisdictions, especially when you're talking about not recently, you could end up in a situation where someone's truly not safe, and the best way to keep them safe is to be in solitary for like 24 hours a day or with one other person. And so what they wanted to avoid, this is my generous reading of it, at least, that they wanted to avoid a situation in which the prison says, can't keep them safe, so we're just going to lock them up, throw away the key, whatever. It's and to that extent, putting the burden on them to create a safe environment for people. Big thumbs up from me, right? That them trying to dump them in the women's prison is another example of them shirking that responsibility to keep men safe in the men's prisons. So the regulation says that you can't have this separate facility, wing, unit, et cetera, unless it's via court order or settlement. So
it seems like it's incoherent, because if the elimination of rape requires segregation, like you segregate rapists from non-rapists or rapees, whatever, right? You separate people.
But it's more complicated than that, because so there's some real inconvenient demographic facts about prison rape. And one of which is most victims are also perpetrators, and most perpetrators are also victims.
Could we do like little stick figures in my mind without getting too graphic?
Yeah, 50% of victims of prison rape are sex offenders, and 50% of perpetrators of prison rape have been a victim of prison rape.
Okay.
So keeping them safe doesn't keep them safe from each other. Like you can't actually separate rapists from, what did you say, rapey?
Yeah. Well,
I don't know, grammatically.
With two E's, not EY. But okay, so what you're saying is people who are put in prison due to sex crime of some sort,
mm-hmm.
They get in prison and then they get sex crimed. They get raped in prison.
50% of victims of prison rape are sex offenders, are serving time for sex offenses.
Yeah.
So that's like prior to prison. But also people who are raped in prison also rape other people in prison. That just statistically, it's like 50%. It's a huge, so people look at like transgender identity as, people talk about this as this huge risk factor for victimization. It's nothing compared to sex offender status. And there's a generous overlap in those two demographics as well. 48% of federal trans-identified male prisoners are sex offenders as well. And just this past year, the Department of Justice, or the Bureau of Prisons, finally started tracking transgender status in perpetration. They've been tracking it in victim, which is how they knew it's so disproportionate. But they were anecdotally seeing an increase in the victimization or in the perpetration. So they finally started tracking it, and they found that every single, in 2021, every single federal trans-identified male victim of prison rape is a sex offender. According to their report.
Is it the case that there's prison justice, like criminals are punishing criminals for being sex offenders, right?
The answer is not no to that, but if you actually look at on their website, they have their reports and they have case summaries of all substantiated claims, which is a paragraph at most. It's a couple sentences, explains what happened, basically. And it's not what we picture of, some gang of men confronting a child molester and kind of dishing it out. There's a lot of, I think, complexity psychosexually and all of that stuff that's playing into it. And probably people who have been damaged since childhood, and we don't know why it is, but those numbers are playing out in California as well. A third of the transfer requests are from the men's prison are from sex offenders as well. And most of the most serious instances of harm that we are hearing reported against women in California are not from convicted sex offenders. So it's...
Okay. So again, just another cross-eyed fact of the law. So what put some people, say a man commits a sex crime.
Yeah.
And he's charged and then put in prison for sex. In prison, he says, I don't believe in sex, I believe in gender. And then the prison which the law which prosecuted this man for a sex crime now, via the auspices of gender identity, denies sex. It just doesn't follow. Like they prosecute him for that, and then they say it's not real anymore. I know I'm using sex kind of as a pun, the act versus the fact, but still.
I don't have an answer other than I think that one of the reasons at the beginning you asked about the areas of interest, one of the reasons I think that prisons is such an important place to pay attention to this stuff is because not only is it being operated on much more quietly, and implemented, and it's the most vulnerable group of people who literally can't do anything else. They're stuck there. But because there's these unique factors that we're seeing quite by accident, just in our work of doing our investigations and learning things that there's something about the prison population specifically that, as far as I know, is not playing out in the general population. But it's a very dangerous group of people, and we can't say that it's not. So.
And
Yeah.
thinking optically, let's say the ACLU is going to bat for transgender prisoners. It seems like that's a high cost if they are basically facilitate, if a transgender, if a male identifies as a woman, gets placed in a female prison and then does bad things to women, and the ACLU is facilitating that, are they not culpable for the crimes that are committed?
Absolutely, they're culpable morally.
They're not even having to think along that line yet. There is still a ton of institutional support within the prison system right now in California to pretend and not be willing to do anything to verify any problems with any of the male transfers. Okay. So I don't think the ACLU.
What's the incentive
Media
structure?
doesn't report on it.
Okay,
so there's no accountability.
So accountability on a media level is one thing, but is it cheaper for the prison industry to facilitate this? Is it easier for them? Is it just like
women don't sue as much as men?
Okay.
So they can be reasonably sure that they will be sued by a man who is seeking transfer to a women's facility, and they can be reasonably sure they're not going to be sued by a woman who's being housed with a man. Mm-hmm. Until now.
Okay. So until now, is there what is this? Is there a structure? Is there an institution that you guys are formulating, or a bunch of briefs? Like, what's the process, the technical, mechanical process of reversing that incentive structure?
Yeah.
Is it raising awareness to women prisoners, giving them access, or is it to actually petition on their behalf through the state and the prison system? What?
So we filed the lawsuit framing claims on behalf of 4 individual women, not for damages for any past events, but challenging the law on its face and describing the harms that these 4 and many other women are experiencing, framing those harms in terms of being cruel and unusual punishment, a deprivation of equal protection of the law based on sex, violations of our First Amendment rights and the Establishment Clause, and looking to say for the federal court to tell the prison system, you just can't enforce this law. You just can't. You just can't be allowed to enforce this without violating the Constitution. So that's it's we're seeking an injunction against any kind of rolling back to before men started transferring over.
Could we define injunction just for idiots like me? What exactly is that?
Yeah, we're looking for the court to tell the prison system, you are not allowed to transfer anybody else. And in fact, you need to find a separate place that isn't the women's prison for men you have transferred over so far.
And you're doing that within California. And if California adopts that, then it gets kicked up federally, or do other states just...
If we win at this level and they appeal, then it would get kicked up. I imagine they would appeal.
And
we will if we don't win. So
okay, yeah. So what would help you? I guess financial, of course. You guys get tons of money. I'm sure you want that. But like media attention, like what would actually, from the outsider point of view, the public facilitate the process that you're trying to put in?
Yeah, media, and then funding is a huge thing. Wolf is funding the Chandler lawsuit very generously, and I know that they're also open to other actions going forward as well. And then other people who might need to do some crowdfunding or things like that. And so it really is. Some of these things, it's not just, fees. It could be costs associated with expert witnesses or different things that can be really substantial. And it's just out of pocket,
So if we look at the funding from your team versus the ACLU or the entire NGO complex, I'm sure you guys are up against a huge dark source of money. And by dark, I don't mean like Darth Vader. I just mean it's filtered through all these NGOs, this kind of super state that kind of rules. There's an asymmetry there. One might say it's like kind of a David Goliath, or maybe
it's not just
mouse
it's not
elephant.
just dollar signs either. You look at the caption on our documents. It's me and Candice. There's like 20 of them from the ACLU, Lambda Legal, Transgender Law Center, some fancy California law firm, and then there's the state attorney general's office and a bunch of bodies at that. And then it's like me and Candice over here. But we're, it's helpful that we're right and that we're really smart. And that they're wrong. So it kind of evens out.
Yeah, because rationality will totally rule the day.
Eventually.
At what cost, I guess, is the
Our
question.
sanity.
Yeah, well, yeah. And women, physical safety.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I don't think there's like a bottom, just so you know. I don't think that there's a point at which some horrible harm happens and people just realize. Like, I don't think it's someone gets murdered or anything. I don't think there's anything like that.
No, because that's the power of the brainwashing effect of this ideology, honestly, around gender. You're able to justify and write off anything you see because you're in pursuit of something that has been pre-concluded and predetermined as a capital G good, a very special and wonderful, mystical, metaphysical good in the universe to be pursuing for yourself and for others. It makes you a very, very, very good person. And there is no mere material harm or injury that can't be written off as, well, it would have happened anyway. Women get raped anyway. There are some male guards, some women do get pregnant in prison anyway. It happens anyway. That's a big one here.
That's what happened.
You hear that? People say that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They asked Senator Scott Wiener, who is one of the sponsors of the bill. A reporter asked him after we filed suit about one of our plaintiffs who was sexually assaulted. And he said that sexual assault is nothing new to men's or women's prisons and that there's channels in place to deal with it or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh.
That's what he said.
Okay. Wow. Was he the spearhead or? Well,
sorry.
Some jokes about that. No, that's okay. Maybe he'll identify as a eunuch if the right person gets a hold of him. Anyway, so he's the guy who's pushing the law where California is like this sanctuary city or state for transgender youth, right?
Yep.
So California's kind of becoming a sausage factory in a way.
He also didn't he spearhead that change in the statute of limitations? They called it like age of consent parity. Yeah. So instead of making it harder for men to molest little boys, they made it easier for them to molest little girls. Almost got that mixed up. Just wrong thinking.
That's kind of equality and parity that's important for the gay community, right? Yeah.
Men's rights.
So activists like that, politician activists like that are perfect examples of how this isn't just the gender identity thread, it's also the queer sexuality thread. And it's in that intersection of gender identity and queer theory that you see a lot of things that are motivating and concerning parents a lot right now, motivating and concerning a lot of lesbian and gay people across the country, because it's like, oh, wait a minute. No, this is not being done in our name. No, this is not pro-gay. This is not what gay needs or what being homosexual is about or what we've ever thought we needed in society. This is really, truly an endangerment and ripping down of safeguards for vulnerable groups, women and children.
So how many steps is there between what's happening with regard to males and female prisons, and how many steps between the erosion of sex as a reality and the erosion of age as a reality? Is the law more stable with regard to age than it is to sex?
No. And in part because of the way that critical theory around gender and around sexuality, the way that queer theory academically and then translated or sort of infiltrated into social justice politics, the way that has happened, there's never been any defined or described even parameter or criteria that would limit this I am whoever I say I am and whatever I say I am to. There's nothing that's ever limited that to sex. There's nothing that's ever said, for some reason, the category of male and female is what can be subjectively chosen and felt. I can feel my way through it, but nothing else. Not my age, not my date of birth, not my place of birth, not, there is no reason why that kind of self-determination wouldn't apply to any kind of characteristic or experience or group or categorization of any kind. The only reason why it's been so heavily gender focused so far, I think, is because sex is a universal characteristic. Everybody has one. And so everybody is potentially in play when it comes to playing around with concepts of sex versus what is sex and how is it determined. So there's an inherent connection between sex and sexuality, and the way that age automatically plays into that is that from the very beginning of discussions of sex and sexuality, one of the main norms, other than the sex binary, that has always been under attack academically and now politically is age, that it is arbitrary, that it is stifling, that it is oppressive to impose age-based rules or restrictions or judgments or moral rules against anybody because of age, whether it's because they are young and what we would have always called underage, or whether it's because they are older and facing certain realities from that. So the age and sexuality and sex continuum or connect the dots is almost automatic. If you're going to rip down the sex boundary, you are ripping down the age boundary.
Okay. Sorry, there's this Johnny Rotten, I think. No, not Johnny Rotten. The guy who, the head of Jackass, which is an MTV, like, a really stupid show where these bros, like, just damage their bodies by hitting each other in the testicles or running into barbed wire fences or something like that. He did a movie, Johnny something, he did a movie where he identified as mentally challenged in order to get into the Special Olympics. Oh. And I don't know if that, I don't know if it's an easier pill to swallow at this particular point in history for, let's say, a grown man identifying as a team in order to play on a teen sports league and then just haul ass and get a bunch of awards. It seems like that would be the social norm of rejecting that rather than the law. The law wouldn't be able to object that, especially if there's so much power.
Radical feminists checking in here.
Okay.
That's because in that scenario, you have an adult man who's impacting the athletic opportunities for boys, not for girls and women. And that is something that is valued by our society. It would feel unfair to ask them to accommodate some adult's whim to want to do that throwback thing. That's my opinion.
But it just seems like it would be a harder pill to swallow, whereas a teenage boy identifying as a teenage girl is kind of championed under the trans rights acceptance push, the civil liberties thing, right?
But
So
it's, I think it harder, this whole identity thing. It's so funny because when we talk about it, I think some people are asking us to believe it versus people asking us to just act like it. But there are some people who insist that we change our inner selves to, it's not enough to just act like it. You have to, they want to see it in your eyes that they want you to sacrifice your firstborn and everything to it.
Well, yeah.
Basically.
But I guess my point is that the law is just a bunch of pieces of paper. And it's the enforcement of the law, which means it's the culture that believes in the law and then follows through on that. So the shift in gender, what you guys are doing with the law, needs to be facilitated or backed up by a cultural perception in order for it to actually take effect. And you would have to change people's perspective on a mass scale, or at least probably don't have to change them. You just need to make them aware of that, and kind of poke through the narrative that is backing up this push.
I think that's right. But yeah, and I do think that the appearance of some kind of social dominance or consensus that identity is paramount and purely self-determined and unchallengeable. I think that's a very false consensus. I don't think that that's where most people are at. I don't think that we have the hard job of, say, shifting the Overton window. I think we have the slightly easier job of making of pointing out what the impacts really are, what the inconsistencies and incoherencies really are, and just trying to give enough people permission to voice what is already their own skepticism. Like
breaking through the narrative that it's kind of a left-right thing, which it really only is for activists and elected officials. That's where I'm a lefty. Most of my friends and family are lefties. And if you don't approach it like you're telling them some dirty secret about yourself, if you're just like, hey, yeah, this is what's going on and we're suing California for this. And you literally just say factually what's going on. That's fine. And, there's kind of a grassroots consciousness raising on the left about this issue. And we're seeing state lawmakers, dozens of them, Democratic lawmakers at the state level who are voting for Save Women's Sports bills and for child trans bans and things like that. So that's very heartening. And there's just really like a chokehold in the nonprofit advocacy, political party kind of, and it's just not reality at all. So you're talking about giving people permission, but I really think just letting people know it's not, it's not left, right. Everyone basically agrees on this stuff. They just don't know it yet.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So what is this thing that you guys are doing called? I didn't ask that at the beginning. Do you guys have a cool name or an acronym? Oh, no.
Yeah, our names are cool enough that our law firm name is cool too. So we are Jackson Bone LLP. And I tried to pitch Lauren on a business slogan that would be, Jackson Bone, because we know who the women are, but she wouldn't let me do that. So we talk about civil rights and rational solutions, and frame things in that way that we've got to return to some objective logic and basic fundamentals of law here, and then we can hash out Hey, you describe for me what the group of people even is that we're talking about, and I would be glad to have a conversation about how to improve their quality of life without harming anybody else. Mm-hmm. But you can't even tell me who the group of people is, and that freaks me out because law does not deal with that very well without then becoming extremely repressive and dictatorial and authoritarian toward anyone who's not in that focused on undefinable group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine that while the prison issue is very graphic, very gut-wrenching, and just like very obviously like there's bad things to look at. Even though that is the case, I'm sure that there'd probably be more support on the public level with regard to schools, maybe, and parents protecting their children. There's all these different vectors of work to do and vectors of interest to get people involved, and to kind of like spend their time and their money and their energy pushing in any given direction. So bringing up schools, is there any cases or fronts that you guys are seeing for parents and challenges in that domain? Because I think that there's a lot of groundswell support on that, probably even more than sports. But I think it still we haven't seen the crest of that wave of parents actually standing up, but more and more and more are waking up to this. So.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that they also, one of the differences is that is a group that has a lot more political power. They can definitely use legal tactics as a strategy. They can also, vote and show up at meetings and stuff. But I do think that we're definitely looking at that in terms of our strategy of addressing this issue, in particular, just in the current context of having these proposed rules, and there's other different things going on federally and at a state level. So, but it's like parents and parents' rights, students' rights, teachers' rights. It's everybody interacting with the education system has their own rights as individuals, especially if this school or this education system is a state actor, and therefore we've seen some of the most success so far for cases that have had that. Like there's a case last year that was decided, or it's, I guess, still being kind of appealed, but Meriwether, which was a professor and preferred pronouns. And it was a great case because it was decided not just on religious beliefs, but on free speech and academic freedom grounds. And that's very, very important.
What was the case, just in brief? What was the brief?
It's Meriwether versus, oh God.
So a teacher didn't want to use...
Professor.
Okay, so professor denied pronoun.
Yeah, he didn't want to use any pronouns. He was willing to use just the person's name. And it worked for a little bit, and then it didn't work, and there was a whole back and forth, and eventually he the school took the side of the student, and the court took the side of him, and found that they were, because he did bring a religious discrimination claim on it as well, not just, and they did not treat it in a balanced way with regards to his religious claim at all. And so that reflected really poorly on the school as well, because they didn't approach it seriously in any way. But and there's other cases, there's similar cases that are in different jurisdictions that are making their way through. So teachers are fighting that battle.
It's interesting. I know that Maya Forstater case out in the UK hinged on her belief in gender critical.
Yeah.
Like they had to, it's interesting where we all have to be believers now. We have to put on the mantle of a religious exemption for biological reality. It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I hope that people keep in mind the difference between statements of fact and statements of belief. Both might be protected, maybe for different reasons and at different boundary lines, right? And so I think it is important that we keep fighting for recognition that statement of a pure fact, a bare fact, it just cannot form one of those building blocks of harassment or some kind of discrimination charge. And then separately, so with Maya Forstatter's case, you could argue that the belief portion was in a part two. So one is male and female exist, and that's a thing. The belief part is that matters. That is significant to how women fare in society. That is fairly characterized as a political belief or some kind of sociological belief that I've said the fact. Now I'm going to tell you why that fact matters and what society can do about it. So that is a distinction that should continue to be fought for here in the U.S. Is no, it is not just a matter of, well, I believe this, but you believe that. There does need to be a restoration of a base level of objective fact before we go back to arguing about, therefore, what should we do about those facts? That was the classic battle of the sexes. That's where we were for a while. And this has derailed that.
We also have, facts aside, we have the right to not believe anything at all. We don't have to have a belief in sex as a biological thing. We could still just choose. I could be agnostic on that, on the issue of the gender identity. I could say, I don't know, maybe it sounds reasonable. Maybe I believe, but I don't know if I believe. And you still can't compel me to believe, even if I don't believe something else. Because it is a faith-based thing. It's essentially a gendered soul. And I don't have to, this is America. I don't have to believe in a soul. I could believe we're all lizards if I want.
Or at least those in charge.
And I could see if I could get some people to pass a law saying you all have to believe it too. We'll see how it goes.
So what's some things coming up? I'll put all the links in the description, but do you guys do like a legal podcast on this? Or are there rolling updates? Do you have like a, what would it be called? A media arm? She just cut out.
Candice ditched us. We did set up a Twitter. So it's Jackson Bone Law, and be updating that in our website, jacksonbonelaw.com. And we can be following those. We have filed one action already on detransitioning. And so at this time, that's not something, just for strategic reasons and for privacy reasons, not going to be public on the details of, but that might change coming up here. But we've also had a lot of inquiries on the same issue from other people. So it's just a matter of vetting those for within the statute of limitations. Is it a state we practice in, and all of that.
Okay. There she is. So we didn't get into the detransition front, but just briefly, we can wrap it up here. But just briefly, what is some of the movement or the vectors of Lawfare with regard to detransition, and what are some of the resources in that direction?
Yeah, I want to focus on holding the mental health professional side of things accountable. I think that they are the linchpin in many ways to all of the medicalization, in the sense that, a lot of times I think a surgeon or an endo or a pediatrician who prescribes stuff can very easily say, but wait a minute, I took medical necessity as a given based on this professional over here saying that for mental health reasons, for this person, this is medically necessary. Then I did my job. So I think that kind of passing the buck needs to stop at the mental health side. And that's what we're focused on with our first case out of the gate, is going after the two mental health professionals who, just as a matter of boilerplate and just pushing somebody onto a conveyor belt, these two signed off on letters for surgery.
And would an organization like WPATH or the APA or some sort of like professional organization, are they ever held accountable? And would that be where the buck stopped? Can you sue those organizations? Or are they like super legal?
That is much more difficult. So we are in some strategizing sessions with some people who have had their eyes on how do we go after the professional associations. That would break down the false consensus is to make them answer for some of this. So it is not straightforward here in the US at all, because they put out guidance, they put out best practices, they train professionals, but it's still the professional's independent judgment, and it's still state or federal law, and it's still this and it's still that. So it's a little indirect, and would require some, I think, novel applications of theories, but it is definitely on our radar to try to figure out how to do that. Same thing, similarly, analogously to me, I would love to go after some of the groups that actually get into schools, that are outside groups that come in and do the trainings and write the BS and train the trainers and so forth. It is almost outright fraud, I think, what goes on, that they come into government-funded schools and lie.
But they lie virtuously.
Very. Those are the best kinds of liars.
Wow, we got into some intense stuff. Candice, we've done this, I guess this is my third time speaking with you, I believe, and recording, and it's great to meet you as well, Lauren. So I'll link all the links in the description. Any other tidbits you guys want to leave the audience with? Either black pill or white pill, hope or despair, call to arms, anything like that.
I think one thing past the Salem witch trials, we'll get past this too.
That's right. And I think just in the last few weeks, and now the number of people that have kind of given encouragement and expressed a desire to help the potential clients that we want to be representing and working with is really heartening. I think the legal aspect of this is just one of the threads that is coming together to really push back on this, so that I think a lot of us feel like this has been a distraction, an unfortunate distraction, and I hope that we use the opportunities that are in here to, for example, build a more rational and coalesced women's movement. I think that's going to be a benefit from all of this. I think that fewer things being automatically left-right is going to be a benefit, and I think there's going to be some settling in, despite any kind of surface backlash. I think there's going to be some open settling in of gay and lesbian Americans into society, and openly acknowledging and recognizing that, actually there are a lot of us that want to be part of mainstream society, and it is not, there's no inherent link between homosexuality and queerness.
Lauren, last words?
Just, I'm really excited to be working on this, and I think it's going to look really different a year from now.
Oh, wow. Okay. That soon. The law doesn't usually...
It's not just law, it's the politics too. It's everything together, because when you have things, it starts to influence the way lawmakers and bureaucrats do things in response. And so it's like an ecosystem. So we're trying to kind of throw a wrench in it.
Wow.
From that perspective.
Amazing. Hopeful. I think Candice is frozen yet again. Oh, no, there she is, blinking in and out. Okay. Well, thank you both so much for your time and for all the work you do. And have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Bye, Candice. Thank you. Have fun with your family. Okay. Oh.